The first time it happened, Daniel didn't think much of it. He came down to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, early, around 6:15, like he always did, and the chair on the far side of the table was pulled out slightly. Not much, maybe 3 or 4 inches, just enough that the edge of it caught the morning light differently than the others. He looked at it for a second, the way you look at something you weren't expecting but can't quite explain why it bothers you. And then he pushed it back in, made his coffee, and forgot about it completely. That was the kind of person Daniel was. He lived alone in a house he'd bought 2 years earlier, after his divorce, a narrow 2-story place on a quiet street in a town he didn't grow up in. He had a routine that he followed with the precision of someone who uses routine the way other people use medication. He woke at 6, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, then showered, dressed, and left for work. He came home around 6 in the evening, cooked something simple, watched an hour of television, and went to bed. He didn't have pets. He rarely had guests. The house was his, and he kept it exactly the way he wanted it. So when the chair was out again on Thursday morning, he noticed it immediately. Same chair, same side of the table, this time pulled out maybe 5 or 6 inches, a little more than before. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks, holding his phone, staring at it for longer than he probably should have. He thought through the obvious explanations the way you do when something doesn't fit. Had he left it like that the night before? He didn't think so. Had he gotten up in the middle of the night without remembering it? He sometimes had trouble sleeping, but he didn't think he'd gone to the kitchen. The floor was cold at night. He would have noticed. He pushed the chair back in, sat down, made his coffee, and as he sat there that morning, he realized he was thinking about Monday. Had the chair been out on Monday? He tried to remember. He couldn't. Maybe it had always been slightly out, and he'd never paid close enough attention. That felt like the most reasonable explanation, and he decided to accept it. People notice patterns that aren't there all the time. The brain is very good at manufacturing significance out of coincidence. He knew that. He tried to remember that. But by Saturday, he had started checking. He didn't tell himself that's what he was doing. He just made a point of pushing the chair all the way in before going to bed, making sure it was flush with the table edge the way the other 3 were. He even straightened the placemat. He stood back, looked at it, committed the image to memory, and went upstairs. He slept okay. Not great, but okay. When he came down the next morning, the chair was out again, this time at a slight angle, not just pulled straight back, but turned a few degrees to the left, so that it was facing the window more than the table. He stood in the doorway and did not move for almost a full minute. The angle bothered him more than the distance. Distance he could maybe explain. The floor was slightly uneven in parts. Old houses settle. He'd felt a chair shift on its own before. But the angle was different. The angle meant rotation. Something would have had to apply a sideways force. He couldn't explain that with an uneven floor. He went through the possibilities slowly and methodically, the way an engineer would, which is exactly what he was. Vibrations from traffic outside, the house shifting in cold air overnight. He'd read once about how old wooden floors could warp and move in ways that seemed impossible. He filed those explanations away as possibilities and kept going with his morning. He didn't mention it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to, really. He talked to his sister on the phone every Sunday, but he wasn't going to tell her he was unsettled by a kitchen chair. She already thought he was too in his head since the divorce. His co-workers were fine, but not close. He had a friend from college he texted occasionally, but what would he say? "I think my chair is moving at night." He'd sound ridiculous. He was probably being ridiculous. He decided to let it go. By the following Wednesday, he had a notebook. He hadn't planned on keeping a record. It had started as just one thought, while he was eating dinner, that if the chair moved again, it might be useful to write down exactly how far and in what direction. That way he could look at it objectively. He was an engineer. He believed in data. The notebook made sense. That night before bed, He measured the distance from the chair to the table edge, using his hand as a rough ruler, then noted the angle of the seat relative to the window. He wrote both numbers down, added the date and time, and went upstairs. In the morning, he came down to find the chair moved back farther and rotated more clearly to the left, almost as if someone had sat in it and turned toward the kitchen counter. He stood there with the notebook in his hand and wrote the new measurements down before he did anything else, before he made coffee, before he turned on the light. He told himself this was perfectly rational behavior. What he didn't write in the notebook, because he wasn't ready to write it yet, was that the chair was always the same one. There were 4 chairs at that table. 3 of them had never moved. Not once, not even slightly. Only this one, the one closest to the window on the far left side of the table. He had no explanation for why it would be this specific chair if the movement was accidental or environmental. Vibrations wouldn't choose a chair. Settling floors wouldn't rotate one seat and leave the others perfectly still. He didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. By the end of the second week, he had 11 entries in the notebook, 11 mornings where the chair had been moved. He hadn't missed a single one. And when he laid the notes out on the table and read through them slowly, he saw something he hadn't expected. Something that made the coffee in his hand feel suddenly warmer than it should. The movements weren't random. They were increasing, not dramatically. This wasn't the chair flying across the room. But when he read the numbers carefully, the direction of the rotation was consistent. The distance from the table was increasing in small increments, and the angle of the seat was moving over 11 days in a slow and deliberate arc that was pointing very gradually toward the corner of the kitchen, the corner where the back door was. He didn't go to work that day. He called in saying he wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely untrue, and spent the morning sitting at the kitchen table, at a different chair, not the one that moved, going through the notebook again. He had a yellow highlighter and marked every measurement, every angle, then drew a rough sketch of the kitchen on a blank page and plotted the chair's position each morning with a small dot. When he connected the dots with a line, slowly, carefully, the arc was obvious, gradual but obvious. The chair was rotating, 1 or 2 degrees at a time, every single night for 2 weeks, and it was pointing toward the back door more clearly with each day that passed. He thought about the back door. It was a standard door, wood with a small glass panel at the top, double-locked. The original key lock, plus a sliding bolt he'd installed himself shortly after moving in. He checked the door now. Both locks were engaged the way he always left them. He tested the handle. It didn't move. He stood on the tile by the door for a moment and looked out through the small glass panel into the backyard, which was empty and still and very ordinary in the grey morning light. He didn't know what he was looking for. He didn't find anything. He went back to the table and tried to think clearly. He was a logical person. He believed in cause and effect. There was a cause for this, something physical and explicable, and the fact that he hadn't found it yet didn't mean it wasn't there. He considered the possibility that he was doing it himself. He'd read about parasomnia, sleepwalking, behaviors people perform without any awareness or memory. It wasn't common in adults without prior history, but it wasn't impossible. Maybe he was coming down in the night, in some half-conscious state and moving the chair without knowing it. He couldn't rule that out. But even if it was him, even if his own sleeping body was responsible, then the question became why. Why would he move the same chair, in the same direction, in a pattern so consistent it looked deliberate? What was he doing? That night, he set up his phone to record the kitchen. He propped it on the counter between 2 books, angled to catch the full table and the chair. He had a motion sensor app he'd downloaded quickly, the kind people use for basic home security, and he activated it before going upstairs. He pushed the chair in flush with the table, as he always did now, and stood in the kitchen for a moment listening to the silence of the house. It was a very quiet house. That had been one of the things he liked about it when he first moved in. Now, the silence felt different. Not threatening exactly, but dense, like something was pressing against it from the inside. He woke up at 3:42 in the morning to a notification from the app. Motion detected. He lay in bed for several seconds, fully awake, his heart doing something he could feel in his throat. And then he got up and walked to the top of the stairs and listened. Nothing, no sound. The house was dark and silent below him. He went downstairs slowly, turning on lights as he went, and stood in the kitchen doorway. The chair had moved. Not dramatically. An inch, maybe two, pulled back from the table at the familiar slight angle. The phone on the counter was still recording. He walked over and stopped it and looked at what it had captured. The video was dark and grainy, the kitchen lit only by the small light above the stove that he always left on at night. He scrubbed through it slowly, watching the empty kitchen, watching the still table, watching the chair. For 2 hours, nothing moved. And then at 3:38 in the morning, the video showed something. A shift, not a dramatic slide, not a sudden motion, just a slow, almost imperceptible drift of the chair, moving away from the table as if pushed by a pressure that came from nowhere, settling into its new position over about 4 seconds. He watched it 12 times. There was no one in the room. There was no visible force. The other chairs didn't move. The papers on the counter didn't stir. The only thing that changed in the entire frame over 4 quiet seconds at 3:38 in the morning was the chair. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house on, the notebook open in front of him, and tried very hard to think of a scientific explanation for what he had seen. Thermal expansion, he kept thinking, though he didn't fully believe it. Drafts, pressure differentials, the way old houses move. In the morning, he called a former colleague, an older man, practical and unsentimental, someone Daniel trusted to not make things strange. He described the chair, the pattern, the video. He tried to sound like he was presenting a minor engineering puzzle, which is how he wanted to think about it. The friend listened without interrupting, which was not his usual style. And when Daniel finished, there was a pause that lasted slightly too long before the man said, "Have you had anyone look at the floor joists?" Daniel said he hadn't. The friend said he should, that old houses moved in surprising ways, and said it with the tone of a person who has found a satisfying explanation and would like to stop talking about it. Daniel said he'd look into it. He never called a contractor. He's not sure why. Part of it was that he didn't entirely believe it was the floor. Part of it was that he didn't know what he'd do if a contractor came in, looked at everything carefully, and told him the floor was perfectly fine. The chair has moved every morning for 31 days now. The arc in his notebook is almost complete. The seat is pointing almost directly at the back door. Just a few degrees off, maybe 3 or 4 mornings away from what feels like some kind of alignment. He doesn't know what happens when it gets there. He tells himself nothing will happen, that the pattern will break, that there's some obvious explanation he's been too close to see. But every night before he goes to bed, he checks the door. Both locks. Every night, without exception. And every morning he comes downstairs with the notebook and writes down what he finds. He hasn't told anyone about the video.